The year is 1871, and the Cuyahoga River is burning. Not literally, not yet, but the city of Cleveland is ablaze with the frenetic, dirty energy of the early oil boom. It is a time of mud, greed, and crude ambition, a chaotic gold rush where fortunes are drilled from the earth one day and evaporated by market fluctuations the next. Men scream on trading floors, barrel prices swing violently from pennies to dollars, and the air is thick with the sulfurous stench of unrefined kerosene. In the center of this anarchic storm stands a man who despises the noise. He is 32 years old, immaculately dressed, and terrifyingly calm. He looks at the burgeoning industry not with the hunger of a prospector, but with the cold, discerning eye of an undertaker measuring a casket. To John D. Rockefeller, the volatility of the free market was not an opportunity, it was an error. It was a chaotic inefficiency that offended his Baptist sensibilities as deeply as it threatened his balance sheet. He did not want to play the game better than his rivals. He wanted to redesign the board so that they could not play at all. Now, let us open the archives and reveal the shadow behind the success. To understand the anatomy of the Cleveland Massacre, one must first understand the psychology of its architect. We often mistake Rockefeller for a mere capitalist and a man driven by the accumulation of wealth. This is a shallow reading of the forensic evidence. Rockefeller was a zealot of order. He viewed the wildcatters and independent refiners of Pennsylvania not as peers, but as agents of chaos, wasteful, irrational, and doomed. In his private correspondence, he spoke of his consolidation of the industry not as a conquest, but as a salvation. He believed he was saving the oil business from itself, replacing the unpredictable whims of competition with the stable, rhythmic hum of a monopoly. But a monopoly is not built on prayer. It is built on leverage. While his competitors were busy drilling wells and chasing gushers, gambling on the supply side, Rockefeller turned his gaze to the arteries of the trade, the railroads. He understood a fundamental truth of logistics that eluded his peers. Oil is useless if it cannot move. If one controls the transport, one owns the commodity. In the winter of 1871, amidst the smoke of cigar-filled back rooms, Rockefeller helped forge a secret alliance that would become the most hated corporation in American history, the South Improvement Company. The name was innocuous, a bureaucratic shield designed to deflect scrutiny. But the mechanism hidden within its charter was a masterpiece of corporate warfare. The plan was simple, brutal, and clandestine. Rockefeller and a select group of conspirators approached the three major rail lines, the Pennsylvania, the Erie, and the New York Central, with a proposition that resembled a Faustian bargain. Rockefeller promised the railroads something they desperately needed: consistent, massive volume. He guaranteed them a steady flow of shipments that would stabilize their own erratic profits. In exchange, he demanded preferential rates. But here is where the genius of the shadow reveals itself. Rockefeller did not just ask for a discount or a rebate on his own shipments. He demanded a drawback on his competitors' shipments.
Now, remember your silence.
Consider the cruelty of this mechanic. Under the South Improvement Company deal, every time a rival refiner in Cleveland shipped a barrel of oil, the railroad would charge them the full rate, take a portion of that fee, and quietly deposit it into Rockefeller's account. It was a tax levied by a private citizen upon his enemies, enforced by the infrastructure of the state. He had engineered a system where his competitors were unknowingly subsidizing their own destruction. Every barrel they sold made Rockefeller richer. Every move they made tightened the noose around their own necks. This was the gospel of order weaponized. It was an invisible siege engine constructed in total secrecy. The independent refiners of Cleveland went about their business, checking the daily prices, haggling with suppliers, completely unaware that the ground beneath their feet had already been sold. They were fighting a battle of margins and efficiency, while Rockefeller was fighting a war of structural elimination. He had effectively rigged the physics of the market. Gravity now pulled only in his direction. As the winter thawed into the spring of 1872, the trap was set. The South Improvement Company was the lever, and the railroads were the fulcrum. Rockefeller sat in his office, the ledger open before him, ready to exert the pressure that would snap the spine of the Cleveland oil industry. The chaos was about to end. The silence was about to begin. The execution of the plan began not with a roar of artillery, but with the quiet scratching of a pen. In late February 1872, the rates on the railroads suddenly shifted. Overnight, the cost for independent refiners to ship their oil to the East Coast nearly doubled. Simultaneously, the price of crude oil, the raw material they needed to survive, spiked. It was a pincer movement of devastating precision, squeezing the margins of the Cleveland independents until the breath left their bodies. Panic, cold and sharp, began to spread through the boardrooms along the Cuyahoga. The refiners were baffled. They looked at the market and saw no reason for this sudden hostility. There was no shortage of oil, no collapse in demand. They were fighting an enemy they could not see, striking from the shadows of a ledger they could not access. They did not know that the South Improvement Company was already active, that the drawbacks were being calculated, and that their own logistical lifelines had been weaponized against them. They only knew that they were bleeding. It was into this atmosphere of dread that John D. Rockefeller stepped out of his carriage and began his visitations. History often remembers the Cleveland Massacre as a hostile takeover, implying aggression and conflict. But the archives paint a more disturbing picture. It was a series of polite conversations, and Rockefeller did not storm the offices of his rivals. He entered them with the demeanor of a concerned pastor visiting a dying parishioner. He was calm, soft-spoken, and terrifyingly reasonable. He would sit across from a rival men he had known for years, men with whom he had dined, and he would open his own books. This was an unprecedented act of transparency, or so it seemed. He showed them the strength of Standard Oil, the efficiency of his operations, and the sheer inevitability of his math. He did not threaten them with violence. He threatened them with reality. Take Standard Oil stock, he would urge them, his voice devoid of malice. It will be the good provider. The proposition was always the same. He offered to buy their refineries at a fair appraisal of their physical value, the bricks, the tanks, the stills. He offered no payment for goodwill or the potential of future profits, for in his mind, they had no future. The choice he laid on the mahogany tables was binary and absolute. Sell to me now and become rich as a shareholder in my empire, or refuse, try to compete, and be crushed by the weight of the railroads until your assets are worth nothing. It was a psychological siege. Rockefeller was asking these men to admit that their life's work, their independence, and their ambition were obsolete. He was asking them to kneel. One by one, they folded. The psychological pressure was exacerbated by the phantom nature of the threat. The South Improvement Company was technically a secret, but Rockefeller ensured that the implication of its power was known. He let the rumors curdle in the minds of his competitors. They knew he had the railroads in his pocket. They just didn't know how deep the pocket went. The fear of the unknown, the invisible hand tightening around their throats, was far more effective than any direct threat. Consider the case of Alexander, Schofield & Co., a firm that initially hesitated. They were proud men, pioneers of the industry. But as they looked at the mounting freight bills and the eerie confidence of Rockefeller, their resolve crumbled. They realized they were playing a game of poker against a man who owned the casino. To resist was not bravery, it was financial suicide. They signed the papers. Then there was the heavy machinery of the psychological toll. Rockefeller didn't just buy the companies, he bought the silence. He required secrecy from the sellers, further isolating those who still held out. A refiner would wake up one morning to find that his neighbor, his ally in the market, had sold out the night before. The circle of resistance shrank by the hour. Paranoia set in. Who was next? Who could be trusted? In less than 6 weeks, the landscape of Cleveland was terraformed. Between February and March of 1872, Rockefeller absorbed 22 of his 26 competitors. It was a blitzkrieg of ink and paper. The speed of the capitulation was staggering. Establishments that had stood as pillars of the local economy were liquidated and absorbed into the Standard Oil organism, often without the public even realizing the deed was done until the signs were repainted. What makes this massacre so chilling to the forensic historian is the absence of blood. There were no strikes, no Pinkerton guards breaking kneecaps, no burning buildings. It was a massacre of the spirit. Rockefeller had broken the will of an entire industry through the sheer application of leverage. He proved that in the new era of industrial capitalism, sovereignty was a myth. There was only efficiency. Those who took the deal, the Faustian bargain, and accepted Standard Oil stock often died incredibly wealthy. Rockefeller was true to his word. The stock was indeed a good provider. But the cost was their agency. They became silent passengers on a ship captained by a man they feared. Those who refused, who clung to their pride and the antiquated notion of fair competition, were systematically starved out, their refineries turning into rusted monuments to their own stubbornness. By the time the public outrage caught up, by the time the press dubbed the South Improvement Company an anaconda, and the regulators moved to dismantle the specific legal framework of the deal, it was already too late. The tactical objective had been achieved. The shell of the South Improvement Company could be discarded because the prize was already secured. Rockefeller owned Cleveland. He controlled the refining capacity of the region, and through that, he controlled the flow of oil to the world. He had created a gilded cage for the industry. Inside, there was stability, profit, and order. Outside, there was only the cold void of the uncaptured market. And as the dust settled on the massacre, John D. Rockefeller stood alone in the center of the ruin he had engineered, not as a victor of war, but as the architect of a new reality. He had proven that competition was a sin, and he was the only one capable of granting absolution. The South Improvement Company was eventually exposed. The public outcry was ferocious, leading to a legislative investigation that formally dissolved the charter only months after its inception. But to the forensic historian, this legal defeat is irrelevant. It was a tactical withdrawal in a war that had already been won. The charter was merely the scaffolding. The building was finished. Rockefeller had already swallowed the competition. When the scaffolding came down, the Standard remained a monolith of refining capacity that no law could easily dismantle. By absorbing the Cleveland refineries, Rockefeller had achieved critical mass. He now controlled so much of the nation's oil flow that he no longer needed a secret conspiracy to dictate terms to the railroads. He could do it by the sheer, undeniable weight of his volume. He had become the market. The Cleveland Massacre was not just a seizure of assets. It was the birth of the modern trust, a leviathan that would go on to control 90% of the oil in the United States. Here lies the true verdict of the archives. The lesson of 1872 is that the free market is fragile. It is a garden that naturally tends toward the jungle wild, overgrown, and competitive unless a gardener arrives with a machete. Rockefeller was that gardener. He proved that efficiency is often the enemy of freedom. To achieve the perfect, frictionless machine of Standard Oil, a machine that lowered the price of kerosene and lit the lamps of the world, he had to extinguish the spark of individual agency. The Standard was a miracle of logistics, a masterpiece of vertical integration where every drop of oil was accounted for, from the wellhead to the wick. But it was also a tomb for the entrepreneurial spirit. The men who had once been kings of their own small hills were reduced to middle managers in Rockefeller's hierarchy, or ghosts haunting the edges of the industry. The chaotic, human pulse of the marketplace had been replaced by the cold, rhythmic ticking of a single clock. Rockefeller spent the rest of his life defending this silence. He viewed his empire not as a predator, but as a benevolent sovereign that brought order to a barbaric world. But as we look back at the portraits of the era, at the stiff collars and the unsmiling faces, we see the cost of this order. The Cleveland Massacre revealed that in the pursuit of absolute stability, one must commit absolute ruthlessness. It showed us that the line between a business strategy and an act of war is often just a matter of phrasing. Rockefeller won. He conquered the chaos. But in doing so, he created a prototype for corporate power that still haunts us today. The entity that is too big to fail, too complex to understand, and too powerful to challenge. He left us with a world that is undeniably brighter, lit by the cheap oil he provided, but also a world that is undeniably smaller, shrinking under the shadow of the giants he birthed. We often look at the titans of history and envy their view from the summit. We forget to look at the debris field at the base of the mountain. John D. Rockefeller taught us that order is not a natural state. It is an imposition of will, bought with the currency of fear and the silencing of dissent. The empire stands, but the ghosts of Cleveland still whisper in the cracks of the foundation. Because in the ledger of history, every debt must eventually be paid.